If there is any truth or worth to the danse macabre, it is simply that novels, movies, TV, and radio programs, even the comic books, dealing with horror always do their work on two levels. On the top is the gross-out level, when Reagan vomits in the priest's face or masturbates with the crucifix in The Exorcist, or when the raw-looking, terribly inside-out monster in John Frankenheimer's Prophecy crunches off the helicopter pilot's head like a Tootsie Pop. The gross-out can be done with varying degrees of artistic finesse, but it's always there. But on another, more potent level, the work of horror really is a dance, a moving, rhythmic search. And what it's looking for is the place where you, the viewer or the reader, live at your most primitive level. The work of horror is not interested in the civilized furniture of our lives. Such a work dances through these rooms which we have fitted out one piece at a time, each piece expressing, we hope, our socially acceptable and pleasantly enlightened character. It is in search of another place, a room which may sometimes resemble the secret den of a Victorian gentleman, sometimes the torture chamber of the Spanish Inquisition, but perhaps most frequently and most successfully, the simple and brutally plain hole of a Stone Age cave dweller. Is horror art? On this second level, the work of horror can be nothing else. It achieves the level of art simply because it is looking for something beyond art, something that predates art. It is looking for what I would call phobic pressure points. The good horror tale will dance its way to the center of your life and find the secret door to the room you believed no one but you knew of. As both Albert Camus and Billy Joel have pointed out, the stranger makes us nervous, but we love to try on his face in secret. Terror, what Hunter Thompson calls fear and loathing, often arises from a pervasive sense of disestablishment, that things are in the unmaking. If that sense of unmaking is sudden and seems personal, if it hits you around the heart, then it lodges in the memory of as a complete set. Just the fact that almost everyone remembers where he or she was at the instant he or she heard the news of the Kennedy assassination is something I find almost as interesting as the fact that no one nerd with a mail-order gun was able to change the entire course of the world history in just 14 seconds or so. That moment of knowledge and the 3-day spasm of stunned grief which followed it is perhaps the closest any people in history has ever come to a total period of mass consciousness and mass empathy and, in retrospect, mass memory. 200 million people in a living freeze. Love cannot achieve that sort of across-the-board hammer strike of emotion, apparently. More's the pity. That broken quote was how Stephen King explains the 3 levels of scary in his treatise on the horror genre known as danse macabre. Now, at the beginning of that quote, he says there are 2 levels of horror, but throughout that chapter he sort of rambles his way into saying that there are 3, which is, if you have read any Stephen King, sort of the way that he goes about things. This is The Weekly Reader, a weekly podcast in which I tackle one big question in literature and maybe talk about a few other things with literature as well. This week will be my top 5 favorite horror novels as we are heading in to fall. I believe the number 1 name on this list will be a bit surprising, maybe a bit of a blindside, but I will defend it and every other pick in this podcast. But first, I want to start off with 2 runners-up, 2 horrific honorable mentions. Quote, behavioral science. The FBI section that deals with serial murder is on the bottom floor of the Academy building in Quantico. Half buried in the earth, Clarice Starling reached it, flushed after a fast walk from Hogan's Alley on the firing range. She had grass in her hair and grass stains on her FBI Academy windbreaker from diving to the ground under fire in an arrest problem on the range. End quote. That's right, the first honorable mention on this list is The Silence of the Lambs, written by Thomas Harris. Now, no, this is not necessarily a horror book. This is not necessarily a scary story. But I think that it has to be relayed that Anthony Hopkins is not the only reason that Hannibal Lecter has lived so large in the American psyche ever since his big screen debut. The character, as written by Thomas Harris, is as scary a big bad as you could ever hope to find in literature, point blank, period. And probably the scariest part about Hannibal Lecter is that he falls into one of these big bad tropes that is so overdone that it's cliche. But he does it in a very different and compelling way. We've all seen or read the cliche of the bad guy who is playing with his prey. The bad guy who gives the protagonist just a little bit of rope. We watched Darth Maul Hulk over the young Obi-Wan Kenobi, just playing with him until Obi-Wan sort of flies in the air and cuts Darth Maul in half. However it was that worked, the Force and yada yada. The point is, we've seen it all before. Here's how it's different when it happens from Hannibal Lecter. All of the other big bads that you've ever seen do that are sort of taunting the protagonist, saying, look at me, I'm so much more powerful than you. Whereas Hannibal Lecter in The Silence of the Lambs is legitimately giving the FBI opportunities to win. If they're smart enough, if they're talented enough, if they have just enough intelligence, they will snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. But they have to be good enough. And the second book to get an honorable mention from me begins as such. Quote, my name is Mary Catherine Blackwood. I'm 18 years old and I live with my sister Constance. I have often thought that with any luck at all I could have been born a werewolf because the two middle fingers on both my hands are the same length. But I have had to be content with what I had. I dislike washing myself, and dogs, and noise. I like my sister Constance, and Richard Plantagenet, and Amanita phalloides, the death cup mushroom. Everyone else in my family is dead. We Have Always Lived in the Castle by Shirley Jackson is one of the strangest books I have ever read, and not strangest in the try-hard sense, not strangest in the way that sometimes Chuck Palahniuk becomes a strange writer, not strangest in the way that fantasy novels become strange, or that horror novels are often strange, or strange in the way that sci-fi or sci-fi fantasy becomes strange, but strange in the most normal way possible. Mary Catherine Blackwood, the narrator of this novel, is such a trip that when things start going really weird in the last third or so of the novel, you're just along for the ride. You don't care. You don't care what's real. You don't care what's fake. You don't care what's made up, what's fantasy. You just don't care. Mary Catherine Blackwood is telling you what is going on, and you are willing to listen. There is an almost fever dream quality to this novel. And the best fever dreams, if there is such a thing, are those fever dreams where you wake up and you were absolutely convinced that what you were experiencing was reality because it was so mundane, so banal, except for this one small thing. There is a reality distortion field to this novel. There is a gravity to the gravitas of this novel. And I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Inception, a movie that is somehow 13 years old already. There is a very strange scene in that movie whereby we learn that if you are in someone else's dream, and this isn't really a spoiler, but if a character is inside someone else's dream, that dream can become suspicious of them, and the populating members of the dream who are not outsiders will turn on that individual. Now, I can't say for sure that Christopher Nolan is familiar with We Have Always Lived in the Castle by Shirley Jackson, but that is a scene that feels very much ripped from these pages. It would be wrong to accuse Christopher Nolan of that, but Christopher Nolan is certainly well read. Quote, "Yesterday the stranger said to me, 'You may easily perceive, Captain Walton, that I have suffered great and unparalleled misfortunes. I had determined at one time that the memory of these evils should die with me, but you have won me to alter my determination. You seek for knowledge and wisdom, as I once did, and I ardently hope that the gratification of your wishes may not be a serpent to sting you as mine has been. I do not know that the relation of my disasters will be useful to you, yet when I reflect that you are pursuing the same course, exposing yourself to the same dangers which have rendered me what I am, I imagine that you may deduce an apt moral from my tale, one that may direct you if you succeed in your undertaking and console you in case of failure. Prepare to hear the occurrences which are usually deemed marvelous. We were among the tamer scenes of nature. I might fear to encounter your unbelief, perhaps your ridicule. But many things will appear possible in these wild and mysterious regions which would provoke the laughter of those unacquainted with the ever-varied powers of nature. Nor can I doubt but that my tale conveys in its series internal evidence of the truth of the events of which it is composed." End quote. This quote comes from the perhaps controversial preface to Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, a novel which I have to be very honest, I did not like when I first read it. In fact, I kind of hated it. I was kind of fed up with it. And in one of my more cantankerous fits during the reading of this novel, you can pick up my copy, and the word "and" is highlighted in pink, and the word "but" is highlighted in blue. Why? Because, well, I'll just do this. Listen to me flip to a random page of the novel here. Do you hear that? And stop. On this page, give me a second here, there are 27 ands and 6 buts. Now, I don't usually make it a habit to complain about butts on this channel. That said, between these two pages, these two kissing pages of fiction, there's probably 400 words, and the fact that around 10% of them are the words but or and, that's incredibly infuriating, at least to me, and that made me realize maybe I'm the outlier. In fact, reading this novel made me realize I'm something of a prose elitist. I don't just want the story and the characters to be good. The words on the page have to be pleasant to me as well, or I become cantankerous. That's not the greatest trait to have as a reader. So I took some time away from the novel to really understand or at least to try to understand a little bit better of what is going on in those pages. And that is where I found a deeper appreciation for Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. The novel was published in 1818. That's about 50 years into the steam engine being fairly efficient and getting work done a whole lot faster. And just 7 years prior to the publishing of this novel, 1811, Friedrich Koenig introduced the first steam printing press in London. 3 years prior to the publication of this novel, Napoleon finished his second reign. In 1812, 6 years prior to the publication of this novel, and this is a wild one, Lord Byron gives his first, and I'm reading this from Wikipedia right now, Lord Byron gives his first address as a member of the House of Lords in defense of Luddite violence against industrialism in his home country of Nottinghamshire. Now, I'm going to read that again, but real quick, just for background. This is also from Wikipedia. A quote from the blurb they have on Frankenstein. Quote, in 1816, Mary, as in Mary Shelley, Percy, and Lord Byron had a competition to see who wrote the best horror short story. After thinking for days, Shelley was inspired to write Frankenstein, an imagining of a scientist who had created life and was horrified by what he had made, end quote. That Lord Byron, the Lord Byron who took the famous retreat with Mary and Percy, where Mary ended up writing Frankenstein, gave an address as a member of the House of Lords in defense of Luddite violence, against industrialism. The world in which this novel was created was a world in flux. The world in which this novel was created was a world terrified of the world changing around them. The people were terrified of the old world reign, represented by people like Napoleon, and the new world which was coming at them, hurtling 1,000 miles an hour, with ever-constant breakthroughs in science and technology. And just to further explicate this, I'm going to read from the Wikipedia article on Luddite. What were Luddites? Quote, the Luddites were members of a 19th century movement of English textile workers which opposed the use of certain types of cost-saving machinery, often by destroying machines in clandestine raids. They protested against manufacturers who used machines in a fraudulent and deceitful manner to replace skilled labor and workers and drive down wages by producing inferior goods. Members of the group referred to themselves as Luddites, self-described followers of Ned Ludd, a legendary weaver whose name was used as a pseudonym in threatening letters to mill owners and government officials, end quote. This is a world of violence and fear. And against that background, Mary Shelley comes up with what might be the perfect example of literature encapsulating fear and eventually violence. So am I a fan of the actual words of the novel? Not really. Is this a novel that would give me nightmares? No, not really. Is this a novel that changed the way I read? A little bit. And the scariest part of this novel to me, when you remove yourself from the writing involved, is the question about the monster himself. The monster in this novel, the creation, the life created by Dr. Frankenstein, did not ask to be created. The monster in this novel did not ask to terrify the people around him. This creation was thrust into existence and through no real fault of his own, was terrifying to those around him and had to be undone. How would that feel? How would it feel to be the monster in this novel? The second scariest part about this book, if you ask me, is the idea of creating life. What does that entail? If you have a religion, what does that mean in your religion? Is that life real life? Does that life have a soul? What does it mean to have a soul? Could there be those among us, if others among us do contain a soul, could there be those among us that do not? Does the form factor of our birth mean anything to that quandary? And if life created in this manner does not have a soul, does it mean that life created in any other way than pee-pee-hoo-ha does not have a soul? And if that is what it means, what is so special about pee-pee-hoo-ha? And the number 4 book on my list of top 5 horror novels, quote, "The Terror, which would not end for another 28 years, if it ever did end, began, so far as I know or can tell, with a boat made from a sheet of paper floating down a gutter swollen with rain. The boat bobbed, listed, righted itself again, dived bravely through treacherous whirlpools, and continued on its way down Witcham Street toward the traffic light which marked the intersection of Witcham and Jackson. The three vertical lenses on all sides of the traffic light were dark this afternoon of fall of 1957, and the houses were all dark too. There had been steady rain for a week now. The 2 days ago the winds had come as well. Most sections of Derry had lost their power then, and it was not back on yet. A boy in yellow slicker with red galoshes ran cheerfully along beside the newspaper boat. The rain had not stopped, but it was finally slackening. It tapped on the yellow hood of the boy's slicker, sounding to his ears like rain on a shed roof. A comfortable, almost cozy sound. The boy in the yellow slicker was George Denbrough. He was 6. His brother, William, known to most of the kids at Derry Elementary, and even to the teachers, who would never have used the nickname to his face, as Stuttering Bill, was at home, hacking out the last of a nasty case of influenza. In the autumn of 1957, 8 months before the real horrors began, and 28 years before the final showdown, Stuttering Bill was 10 years old." End quote. Thus begins It by Stephen King, another novel that I don't think is scary to me in the traditional fashion. In fact, to me, it reads more almost like a fantasy novel. There is this group of young kids. Each one of them has their own strength to add to a team that will ultimately come up against the big bad. All of them led by the brave one, Bill, who has a personal interest in undoing the main villain here. But the interesting thing to me as far as the horror part of this novel is concerned is the town of Derry in this novel. The town of Derry acts almost like a collective unconscious, and springing from that collective unconscious there is Pennywise the Clown. Pennywise the Clown, living in the shadows of the sewers, is probably the shadow of this town. When you talk about Jungian terms, Pennywise is the shadow self of the small, quaint town. Little, humble Derry, Maine. Little, unassuming, quaint town for whom the shadow self is an intergalactic, violence-loving, phallus-eating clown. Checks out. But the novel also reminds me of a quote from William Faulkner. "The past is never dead. It's not even past." There is an element of hauntology lightly coated over this novel. The idea that we're all really stuck in some type of chrono loop, that time never really progresses, it just keeps eating itself. It just keeps rolling over on itself, and all we're here doing is recycling the death that surrounds us. I've never really been one who was afraid of clowns, so that's not really the part that scares me about Pennywise. The part that scares me about Pennywise is that Pennywise has come to this planet to make something very small of this planet. The idea that this is all we've ever known, and what we have always known, it doesn't amount, really, to anything. For some reason, that is something that scares me at my core. That is something that used to scare me even as a child. I remember when I was very, very young, sitting in the back of the car as my parents drove someplace, late at night, staring out the window, looking up at the stars, and for some reason, every time that happened, I would get this wriggling inside my soul that maybe this is when it all stops. Almost a sense of déjà vu, but not really. A sense that that moment, that feeling of being so small, looking up at the stars in the dark, maybe that car ride never ends. Maybe that feeling of smallness is the feeling of forever. Maybe that feeling of nothingness, of nobodiness, maybe that feeling of being curled up in the back of a hunk of metal, flying at speeds that will definitely kill you, maybe that feeling is as close to being alive as we're ever going to get. I know, but it's my list, and I said I was going to defend these novels by my reasoning. And that is what has always scared me about the novel It by Stephen King, the number 3 novel on this list. Quote, "No live organism can continue for long to exist sanely under conditions of absolute reality. Even larks and katydids are supposed by some to dream. Hill House, not sane, stood by itself against its hills, holding darkness within. It had stood so for 80 years, and might stand for 80 more. Within, walls continued upright, bricks met neatly, floors were firm, the doors were sensibly shut. Silence lay steadily against the wood and stone of Hill House. Whatever walked there, walked alone." Now, that is truly a stunning opening paragraph, and even Stephen King thinks so. In Danse Macabre, the aforementioned Danse Macabre, Stephen King says about this opening paragraph, "I think there are few, if any, descriptive passages in the English language that are any finer than this. It is the sort of quiet epiphany every writer hopes for. Words that somehow transcend words. Words which add up to a total greater than the sum of the parts. Analysis of such a paragraph is a mean and shoddy trick, and should almost always be left to college and university professors. Those lepidopterists of literature who, when they see a lovely butterfly, feel that they should immediately run to the field with a net, catch it, kill it with a drop of chloroform, and mount it on a white board, and put it in a glass case where it will still be beautiful, just dead." That is what Stephen King says about the opening paragraph of The Haunting. But like I said earlier, Stephen King will tell you what he thinks and then tell you Another thing that he thinks, for some reason, no matter what he just told you, he's got more to say, don't you know? Following that, Stephen King goes on to say, having said that, let us analyze the paragraph a bit. I promise not to kill it or mount it. However, I have neither the skill nor the inclination, but show me any graduate thesis in the field of English American lit, and I will show you a mess of dead butterflies, most of them killed messily and mounted inexpertly. We'll just stun it for a moment or two, and then let it fly on. All I really want to do is point out how many things this single paragraph does. It begins by suggesting that Hill House is a living organism, tells us that this live organism does not exist under conditions of absolute reality, that because, although here I should add that I may be making an induction Mrs. Jackson did not intend, it does not dream. It is not sane. The paragraph tells us how long its history has been, immediately establishing the historical context that is so important to the haunted house story. And it concludes by telling us that something walks in those rooms and halls of Hill House. All of this in 2 sentences. End quote. And Stephen King is correct on all counts. But to me, that's not where the real horror of this novel resides. That is a very good opening paragraph, one of the best in English literature, I will agree with Stephen King. But it's a bit misleading. Misleading because that's not exactly where this novel leads us, and it doesn't need to. On page 4 of this novel, we get this. It was the first genuinely shining day of summer, a time of year which brought Eleanor always to aching memories of her early childhood, when it had seemed to be summer all the time. She could not remember a winter before her father's death on a cold, wet day. She had taken to wondering lately, during these swift counted years, what had been done with all those wasted summer days. How could she have spent them so wantonly? I am foolish, she told herself. Early every summer, I am very foolish. I am grown up now and know the value of things. Nothing is ever really wasted, she believed sensibly, even one's childhood. And then each year, one summer morning, the warm wind would come down the city street where she walked, and she would be touched with the little cold thought, I have let more time go by. Yet, this morning, driving the little car which she and her sister owned together, apprehensive lest they might still realize that she had come after all and just taken it away, going docilely along the street, following the lines of traffic, stopping when she was bidden and turning when she could, she smiled out at the sunlight slanting along the street and thought, I am going. I am going. I have finally taken a step. This novel is about a woman desperate to live her life, but she just does not know how. And isn't that all of us? Isn't it a constant threat that we might wake up one morning and realize we've wasted too much of it? We're spent. We're used up. We're done. Past expiration. All of those things that we had wanted when we were younger, all of the ways that we had always promised ourselves we would live our life, all of those wonderful hopes and dreams are for naught. And those hopes, those dreams, those grand plots that we have on all of creation when we are younger, they die. They die not with a bang, but a whimper. And we find ourselves suddenly looking back on life. And as Eleanor is making her escape, her big leap towards life, doing what she wants to do, living a little bit sporadically as she has felt she has wasted too much of her life, we get this scene. Quote, she stopped for lunch after she had driven 100 miles and a mile. She found a country restaurant which advertised itself as an old mill. and found herself seated, incredibly, upon a balcony over a dashing stream, looking down upon wet rocks and the intoxicating sparkle of moving water, with a cut-glass bowl of cottage cheese on the table before her and corn sticks in a napkin. Because this was a time and a land where enchantments were swiftly made and broken, she wanted to linger over her lunch, knowing that Hill House always waited for her at the end of her day. The only other people in the dining room were a family party, a mother and a father with a small boy and a girl, and they talked to one another softly and gently, and once the little girl turned and regarded Eleanor with frank curiosity and, after a minute, smiled. The lights from the stream below touched the ceiling and the polished tables and glanced along the little girl's curls, and the little girl's mother said, "She wants her cup of stars." Eleanor looked up, surprised. The little girl was sliding back in her chair, sullenly refusing her milk, while her father frowned and her brother giggled, and her mother said calmly, "She wants her cup of stars." "Indeed, yes," Eleanor thought. "Indeed, so do I. A cup of stars, of course." "Her little cup," the mother was explaining, smiling apologetically at the waitress, who was thunderstruck at the thought that the mill's good country milk was not rich enough for the little girl. "It has stars in the bottom, and she always drinks her milk from it at home. She calls it her cup of stars because she can see the stars while she drinks her milk." The waitress nodded, unconvinced, and the mother told the little girl, "You'll have your milk from your cup of stars tonight when we get home. But just for now, just to be a very good little girl, will you take a little milk from this glass?" "Don't do it," Eleanor told the little girl. "Insist on your cup of stars. Once they have trapped you into being like everyone else, you will never see your cup of stars again. Don't do it." And the little girl glanced at her and smiled a little subtle, dimpling, wholly comprehending smile, and shook her head stubbornly at the glass. Brave girl, Eleanor thought. Wise, brave girl, end quote. Eleanor went to Hill House hoping to reclaim her glass of stars. That's not what was waiting for Eleanor. The number 2 book on this list begins as such, quote, "Jack Torrance thought, officious little prick." Ullman stood 5'5", and when he moved, it was with the prissy speed that seems to be exclusive domain of all small, plump men. The part in his hair was exact, and his dark suit was sober but comforting. "I am a man you can bring your problems to," that suit said to the paying customer. To the hired help, it spoke more curtly. "This had better be good, you." There was a red carnation in the lapel, perhaps so that no one on the street would mistake Stuart Ullman for the local undertaker. As he listened to Ullman speak, Jack admitted to himself that he probably could not have liked any man on that side of the desk, under the circumstances. Ullman had asked a question he hadn't caught. That was bad. Ullman was the type of man who would file such lapses away in a mental Rolodex for later consideration. "I'm sorry? I asked if your wife fully understood what you would be taking on here. And there's your son, of course." He glanced down at the application in front of him. "Daniel, your wife isn't a bit intimidated by the idea? Wendy is an extraordinary woman." End quote. The Shining from Stephen King in 1977. Now, again, I'm not really scared by all of the ghostesses that run around in the Overlook Hotel. I'm not scared by the hedges or the furries performing fellatio. No, the thing that's most interesting here to me is that Jack Torrance wants to be a good father. He really does. You can tell it from his character. You can tell it in the things he tells himself, but he gets lost. He gets lost in himself. He gets lost in his drinking problem. He gets lost in his creative endeavors. He gets lost in his job. And when Jack gets lost, his demons go out to find him. There is also the question of those demons that Jack has and whether or not they are transferable to his son. Certainly, his son suffers because of Jack's demons, but does his son suffer with Jack's demons? In my opinion, that is the real horror of this novel. How many of those demons are transferable through the generations? How much of this horror is hereditary? Certainly Danny sees things in this hotel as well, but Danny had seen things before this hotel, hadn't he? Did Jack see things before they reached the Overlook Hotel? That part, in my opinion, is not quite so clear. Now, I am strictly of the opinion that writers can have all sorts of theories about why they're writing what they're writing, about what their writing means on the page, but there's a couple other things at play. Number one, I don't care what a writer means when he or she writes something. It is not important to me. What is important to me is what I can find on the page, what I can take from the literature. But also, I don't care what the writer intends, because I think that's all hoopla. I think that all of that stuff is reverse engineered after a writer has already written what it was that presented itself in their mind. That's one of the reasons that Frankenstein by Mary Shelley is so fascinating, an historical story. But here with The Shining, as we always have to do with Stephen King, we have to understand, well, maybe we don't have to understand, but we have to ask the question, just what was creeping its way into this novel. Stephen King, for anyone who doesn't know, doesn't even remember writing the novel Cujo. In On Writing, a book by Stephen King which is half memoir and half on the craft of writing, he recounts the fact that he was so coked up, he did not even remember writing the novel Cujo. 116,000 words of fiction that Stephen King just straight up does not remember. Is The Shining Stephen King wondering how much of his demons may be transferable to his children? Are there demons creeping around in your family? I bet there are. Do those demons transfer on to you? That is what this novel is asking. And the number one scary story that I know begins as such. Quote, Lolita, light of my life, fire of my loins, my sin, my soul, Lo-li-ta, the tip of the tongue taking a trip of 3 steps down the palate to a tap at 3 on the teeth. Lo-li-ta. She was low, plain low, in the morning standing 4 feet 10 in one sock. She was Lola in slacks. She was Dolly at school. She was Dolores on the dotted line. But in my arms she was always Lolita. Did she have a precursor? She did. Indeed she did. In point of fact, there may have been no Lolita at all had I not loved one summer a certain initial girl child in the princedom by the sea. Oh, when? About as many years before Lolita was born as my age was that summer. You can always count on a murderer for a fancy prose style. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, exhibit number 1 is what the seraphs, the misinformed, the simple, noble-winged seraphs envied. Look at this tangle of thorns. End quote. Yes, that's right, Lolita by Vladimir Nabokov. For anyone who doesn't know, Lolita is the story of Humble Humbert, a man who finds and abducts a 12-year-old girl. and he abuses her in the worst way you can imagine. Now, this is a story that is not without religious parallel, and you can find the religious stories, you can do the math. I'm not here to make those arguments right now. I'm here to justify why this story is so terrifying. And the number one, there's two real main reasons if you ask me, but the number one reason is that prose. That prose is so striking. That prose is there to lull you to sleep. That prose is there to make you completely resigned to just what it is that you're reading in these pages. The language is so smooth and Humbert is so upfront that you are somehow disarmed. Look, the very reputation, the very ambiance of this book, if you find yourself in literary circles, is impossible to ignore. You know what this book is about before you pick it up. You know where this story is going before you read anything, and still, Humbert in that way is able to convince you to put your guard down. And in fact, so there's a video on my personal channel, a link to which can be found in the description below, where I talk about the difference between Lolita and I can't remember exactly what it was. There was a movie a couple years ago that was released on Netflix that was just, I think it was about cheerleaders or something. It was wild. But the difference between that movie and all the ruckus that it caused was because that movie forced viewers to see young girls in a certain light. These things were depicted on the screen. That's crossing a line. What Lolita does is Lolita is not forcing you to look at Lolita in that way, is not forcing you to be seduced by Lolita. This book is having you seduced by Humbert, and it's a wild trip. The second thing that makes this book so scary is how Humbert is getting away with everything. You hear stories about serial killers and you hear stories about people who abduct children and how it seems easy at times. And if it were all that difficult, probably they couldn't have gotten away with it as many times as they did. But you hear those stories at a strange sort of distance. You don't put yourself in the position. You don't put yourself in the situation. You were not there watching these things unfold. That changes with Lolita. You were there for the ride. You were there every step of the way. And you witness Humbert getting away with these things just as if, because no one around him knows. No one around him knows the better. And how could they? So the most insidiously terrifying thing about this novel is the fact that Humbert's trying to seduce you. Humbert is working on you this entire novel because he's already won what he wanted. But the second most insidious thing about this novel is it makes you cognizant of just what might be going on around you. You would have no idea if Humbert moved in next door to you. You just wouldn't. So there could be things like this going on behind every door on your neighborhood, and you would be none the wiser. Your proximity to these types of things may be closer than ever you would imagine. All of this happens in a book that is so buttery smooth to read that you almost forget what it is that is the actual plot of this novel. So, those are my top 5 scary novels. Frankenstein, It, The Haunting, The Shining, and Lolita. Are those my all-time, forever and only top 5 scary novels? Look, I don't know. Things like this, lists like this, they're so difficult to make and maintain, to stand by them. In fact, if I ever read We Have Always Lived in the Castle again, maybe it would be number 1 for some other reason. And I almost put American Psycho on this list as well. But in my opinion, American Psycho could be on this list not because of the horror of the things that Patrick Bateman is doing, but because it's so impossible to look away from it while Patrick Bateman is doing it. What are your 5 favorite scary stories, and do they have to be novels? Could short stories or possibly even poems apply? Well, it's your list, not mine. I'm not going to tell you what to do, but I will say that coming up in the month of October, we're going to be doing October here on the channel. I am not 100% sure what I mean by that yet, but in the coming weeks, I will have a better idea of what I will be doing in October. So stay tuned for that. If you enjoy or appreciate the work that I do here, hitting the like button really does help me out here on the channel, as it tells YouTube to share this video with other literature lovers. And if you find yourself here by chance but not design, consider hitting the subscribe button in order to stick around for more literary goodness, and I hope to have you back for the next one.